So, the hemshech to what we discussed before Yom Tevim. So, if you may recall, the first year I gave was on Eir Ein Sof, and the second and third was on Tzimtzum. So, I want to continue the sugya which everybody hears about, but there's a lot of confusion and lack of clarity about it, simply because there isn't a lot of data and information, and that is the sugya of Tzimtzum kipshute or not kipshute. So we know that, just begin with what I'm going to be citing, the Mara Mekemis for this year is based on, obviously, first and foremost, Eitz Chaim from the Arizal, because as we discussed, and I'll sum up shortly, the Arizal is Mechadish, Chidish Inyan at Tzimtzum, in Eitz Chaim and Eitz Chaim in several places. And then there were the Talmidei of the Arizal that had different opinions what the Chavana of the Arizal was in the Tzimtzum. Namely, the difference whether it's Kipshute or not Kipshute, which I'll explain. I just want to start with the Mara Mekemis. So, Amnuel Chai Reiki, the Baal Mishnah Chassidim, has a sefer called Yeshel Levov, where there he makes the case that Arizal's Kavana was Tzimtzum Kipshute. There were other Talmidei Arizal that disagreed. Not always the Talmidei of the Arizal, Talmidei Arizal, different generations. Namely, another Shemer Amunim of Rabbi Yosef Irgas disagrees with the Yeshel Levov. And then, as we go to the generations afterwards, I'm not going to go through all the Mara Mekemis. The Rebbe brings them actually in his Shimas Antanya and Perik Zayin Shayichet Vamuna. The Rebbe brings all the sources of those that hold Tzimtzum Kipshute. I'm just mentioning the main ones, the primary ones. And then to jump to the Chassidus Chabad, namely, the Alter Rebbe and Perik Zayin, of course, the Shayichet Vamuna, makes it very clear that he's Shel B'tachlis, those that hold Tzimtzum Kipshute, and he gives the explanations for that there. But after that, you don't have a lot of Chassidus. You're not going to find any Maimorim that really talk about Tzimtzum Kipshute and not Kipshute, which is interesting because there's a Shayichet Vamuna. I should also mention that piece in Shayichet Vamuna was not there in the earlier Tfusim in Tanya, though the Alter Rebbe wrote it, but it was only restored in Tafrei Samach, in the edition of Tafrei Samach that the Rebbe Rasha printed, which is the Tanya that we use now, are copies from Tafrei Samach when it was Mesukin, prepared for print. The Rebbe Rasha went through it. So that's also a discussion. Why was it not there? And then, as I said, the Chassidus Chabad, you're not going to find much. I don't think it's ever mentioned, frankly, by any of the Rabbeim in the Maimorim. Could be, there may be one or two places that I don't recall. Tzimtzum is definitely discussed, and clearly based on the Alter Rebbe, Tzimtzum Shalei Kipshute, not like the shit of the Yeshel Levov. The place that we learn more about it, where we can start really coming to understand, is actually the Rebbe. So in Tafrei Tzadik Tes, Rabbi Chmiel ben Yominson wrote to the Rebbe. I'm looking now, Igros Kodesh is printed in volume 1, page Tes. So he wrote to the Rebbe that Echad Memakir of Emer. The Rebbe is responding to him. What you write to me, Asher Echad Memakir of Emer, one of his friends tells him, Shekol HaShittas b'Zehilchem l'mokim echad. That all the shittas in Tzimtzum all go in one place, meaning they're all basically the same shitta. Nifleisi b'yeser gam al kol saita g'daitach kazeh. That's what the Rebbe writes. B'frat ha'shakvei terosei machnei b'machtove b'shem leimed sifrei ha'mekubolim ki pshita she'ene kein klal u'klal. V'eid b'der harishon shachar Arizal, which is clearly he's talking about the Baal Mishnah's Chassidim, Shu Gilas Lono said that Tzimtzum, Hoye be'inyan at Tzimtzum chiluke days ben Bali Trisim min hakotza lakotza kanira b'svarehem v'nimshecha machlekas gam achakach. Okay, then the Rebbe goes and breaks it down in detail, which is going to be a big part of what I'm going to discuss here. But since here you have the first time somewhat of an analysis, first of all, statement clearly that the shittas are not similar at all. They're very different min hakotza lakotza. Echad ben Makirov was the Michtav Eliyahu, Rabbi Eliyahu Dessler, because he learned Chassidus with each of the Masmid and some others, And he had a conversation with Rabbi Ben Yamison, and he's the one that said that all the shittas really come together, the shit of the Gra, the shit of the Nefesh HaChaim, etc., and the Rebbe clearly shaded it completely. Okay. There's a follow-up letter to this, interestingly, 4 years later in Tafshin Gimel, where the Rebbe spells out the implications of this, of whether Tzimtzum Pshutei or not, which is a big part of what I want to talk about. First of all, what is the difference between the shittas? What are they really arguing about? Is it a mechlekes mitzias? Is it just the words kipshutei, not kipshutei? What does it even mean kipshutei, not kipshutei? So what are they really arguing about? What's the hashkafa differences between them? And secondly, my nafkamina l'peil. Is there nafkamina in aveda b'peil down here on earth? What shita you go with? Or is it all theoretical? And obviously it's not, because there wouldn't be a machlekes if it was just a theory. So that's what I would like to address in detail. And these are most of the sources. I want to just give a few more Marmikemis, where the Rebbe did speak about it in later years. So this is the letter Tzadik Tes and Tavshin Gimel a little. But later in the Sichos of the Rebbe, namely, I'll mention a few by the Suda of Shmini Atzeres Tavshin Lamed Aleph. So the Rashag, so there they would have conversation upstairs in the second floor, 770. And the Rashag would ask questions, others would ask questions. The Rashag was mevatel. Someone mentioned Shimshon Kipshutei, and he was mevatel completely that we don't hold by it. And Alter Rebbe already says, "B'mikri haguf," it's like almost ridiculous to say it, because what does it mean? The Eibishter V'gashmis took himself away. Kipshutei. The Eibishter is not a physical thing unless asar ponim minei. And the Rebbe stopped him and said, "What do you mean mevatel? It's coming. It's a shita from Gedei Yisrael. It's not a shita stam from somebody who's an Amoritz. It's a Gedei Yisrael." And the Rebbe continued and said something for the first time that no one ever heard before. This was a real, this does not say anywhere till the Rebbe. He said, Adarab, Tzimtzum Kipshutei makes more sense, Tzimtzum Kipshutei, than not Kipshutei. And the only reason the Alter Rebbe writes that Tzimtzum is not Kipshutei, because he was makabel from his teachers, from Rabbi Sov, he was makabel that it's that way. And then he explains it. But if you go purely mitzeichel, makes more sense Tzimtzum Kipshutei. That's what the Rebbe said. Now, this was upstairs. There weren't chayzim there. They were just mostly guests. But when the word got downstairs that the Rebbe said that, so Rabbi and others could not accept that. They felt someone misunderstood what the Rebbe said. Because to say that is like as I said, that says no, that there's two shittas, yeah. And that the Alter Rebbe holds for short Tzimtzum not kipshutei also. But to say that it makes more sense Tzimtzum kipshutei, and the Alter Rebbe only said it because that's what he was makabel, that was never said before. Al Kaponim, so that remained shrouded in, okay, a bilti mugadik reshima from the Suda. Is it correct or not correct? It was not clearly stated. But then that summer, I think it was Ekev, Pasha Tov Shalamed Aleph, that Rebbe said it in a Fabrengen. B'kitzur, he said this at that same point. Later, when the Igris came out, I think we found that Igeris in Tov Chav Gimel, if I recall correctly, it also says it. But I can tell you, I was still a kid in those years. I don't remember it, but in the years that I started writing Anochas and working in Chazorah, so on Tov Mem, the Rebbe said it befedish, by Arichas Gedela Shabbos Parshas Devorim Chazein Tov Mem, which was a hemshech to Matas Maseh Tov Mem, and then Parsha Re'eh Tov Mem. And that's when the Rebbe said it without even a question. He said it befedish. And furthermore, in the coming years, I think Shavuos Mem Gimel, and probably Vayakel Mem Vov. I don't remember all these places, but after that, there were quite a few times that Rebbe mentioned it again and again, much more than he ever mentioned it earlier, which is also interesting why the Rebbe in later years made it a very big thing. And basically, the Rebbe's point was, which is a common theme now, today we know it as a given, then it was a big chiddush, that Bechal Atzmus can do whatever he wants. Who Bechal's Magbal Eibishtim Seichel. Just because it doesn't make sense to you doesn't mean it's not possible. And it's coming not mitzad chesod and habeira. If you say the Eibishter Rachmana Litzlan Ozav Hashem Esaoretz because he can't be here, that's already Hagbola. But if you're saying it's Bekecha Bligvul, that he has the power mitzad Gadlus habeira, that's a whole different story. And that was one of the big points that Rebbe made. And yet still, the Alter Rebbe was mekabel mit Rabbi Sov that it's Tzimtzum not kipshutei. But that's already a Kabbalah, which then can be explained and explained well. But it could have been the other way. And as we know in Chassidus, anything that could be another way means there is a darga that it is taka another way. However, b'peil, it's Tzimtzum not kipshutei. So going back to the main question, these are all the sources and the statements. But what does it really mean? In simple English, how do we explain these words, Tzimtzum kipshute, not kipshute? In the letter, Tzadik Tez, the Rebbe breaks it down further and says there are actually 4 days. The Rebbe continues in the letter I was quoting, says that the difference between the opinions is b'shnei yonim ikrim. Ima tzimtzum kipshute eloi, that's one thing. Is it literal or not? Siluk helam, which means, siluk means removed, helam means concealed. That's one area there's a disagreement. And the second, ima tzimtzum urak ba'oyer egam b'moyer. Is it tzimtzum only in oyer or also in the moyer? If efshar b'zeh dalet shittas. And the Rebbe lists 4 shittas. One, tzimtzum kipshute, also in the moyer, or tzimtzum kipshute only in the oyer. And then the other 2, shtaim shein arba, would be tzimtzum lekipshute, but also in the moyer, or tzimtzum lekipshute, but only in the oyer, which is ultimately Chassidus Chabad goes with the 4th approach that I just mentioned. So lekipshute and only in oyer. So basically, is it moyer and oyer? Is it kipshute and not kipshute? Is it also in moyer or only in oyer? And that can be 4 different scenarios. And the Rebbe goes on and explains the 4. He doesn't say much to nafkamina. He just explains what they are. In the Rishima Santanya, the Rebbe actually brings a lot more details, so it goes together hand in hand with this letter. He actually refers to this letter, but it looks like in the Rishimas, I'm looking if he says it here. Yeah. Okay. So now, what's enough? As I said, mine of kamina, and what's the difference in the hashkafa here and mine of kamina bepeil? So let me quote the second letter in Tafshin Gimel. And the Rebbe writes again to Rabbi Yomison. The Rebbe writes like this at the end of a letter in Tafshin Gimel. He says, "Bavade zeche kfei terase al dvar michtove elai b'inyan hatzimtzum." This I'll read inside because it's very powerful esis, and it'll be helpful to understand what I'm going to explain. So you certainly remember my letter to you, Tzimtzum. Remember talking 4 years later. V'hine yizbein ha'odem loy, v'hine yizbein luho nimtze b'zeh ha'mokim, u'b'zu ha'rega, itei mamish. That when a person contemplates that in this mokim and in this rega, in this space and in this moment, is found with him, and the Rebbe then quotes, Ha'admur shalei admur hazokim, ha'bal shem tev ha'arizal rashbi be'ez ha'idra, Rabbi Akiva be'ez tirshu b'ma'is merkova, kein godel k'moishu b'kedesh ha'kadoshim, v'chulu, ad Moshe Rabbeinu olav hashalom b'rega matan teira, ha'loi loi hoye loi shum tfisas mokim u'metzias klal. V'ine bo teiras adach, u'poskol ha'maskona she'en ha'tzimtzum elo ba'er, v'loi chaz v'shalom b'moyer, v'amoyer nimtza ata po mamash k'moishu nimtza b'kedesh ha'kadoshim, the elam ha'asiyah. B'rega matan teira al ha'sinei be'elam ha'atzilas be'elam ha'sa'en sof k'moishu lifnei ha'tzimtzum ha'rishon, k'she'er en sof b'malas kol ha'metzias. With a siman kriya, an exclamation point. That's the paragraph. So you hear the Asius here. That the nafkamina bepeil is that according to Shittas Chassidus Dach, is that right now, this moment, in this place, right here, and anywhere, we have all these things. The Rebbe again quotes the Alter Rebbe, the Baal Shem, he goes backwards. Arizal, Rashbi, the Idra, Rabbi Akiva, by Ma'aseh Merkava, the Kein Gadol and Kedesh HaKadoshim, and all the way to Moshe Rabbeinu on Har Sinai. So you can imagine what kind of effect, if you really were able to contemplate on that and relate to it, how batal b'metzias we would be. And that's the shita of Chassidus. So from this, you can derive the nafkamina and also some of the hashkafa shebazeh. In other words, that those that hold not Tzimtzum is Yakib Shotei, what do they say about all these dargas? Moshe Rabbeinu on Har Sinai and the Kohen Gadol and Kedesh Kadoshim and Rashbi and the Idra v'chulu v'chulu. It's not here with us. They won't say that because it can move on. We say, first of all, Matan Teres are pulling them shaches. Ma'al hal name of the Mishamish. And you say, Afkan by Matan Teres be'emen be'yira be'reses be'ziyah. So you can't say that they hold Chaz v'sholem, that we don't have the experiences of the past or those high madregas. So what is the nafkamina? What is the Rebbe saying? That Dafke Chassidus Chabad in the Shita not Kipshute and also Dafke in Oyer and not in Moed. What is the real Nekuda here? Okay, So these are the questions. Now, let's try to unwrap this a bit. So now, the story is this. If you recall, I think we have to go back. Before we talk about Kipshute, not Kipshute, you have to know what the Chiddush of the Tzimtzum is. Because what are they disagreeing with exactly? As I said in the last shir I gave before the Yom Tov, I said, to say that Arizal was Mechadish, that the Eibishter conceals himself, you don't need the Arizal for that. It's a Pasuk in Teir, Haster Aster Ponai. Even Breishis is Bora Likim, even according to Rashi. The Midas Adin, what does it mean? The Eibishter conceals his Eir. You don't need to have any big Chidushim to know that Elikus is not Begoli in this world. You know, Kral Amli, Svarahi, I mean, just look around, Mitzias. So I explained there that the Chiddush of the Arizal is not that the Eibishter concealed himself. The Chiddush of the Arizal, can we relate to the Einareich of Elikus, that's Lifnei Tzimtzum, in the Asis of the Arizal? Or can we only relate to Elikus as the Elikus chose to relate to existence? Which would mean basically like the Shittas Haramak or other Mekubalim, that everyone agrees the Eibishter is beyond everything. I mean, there's all the Lashenas that clearly beyond. But you could also say Elon Esek ben Estaris and Malafonim al Mala'achir is off limits. We have no connection. What Atzmus is in language of Chassidus, what is basically in our language before the Tzimtzum is completely off limits, period. That is, as Chiddush was no. It's Taki Shalei Be'erech, but the Eibishter gave us a way of understanding the Shalei Be'erech by creating a Tzimtzum. Because the Tzimtzum tells you two things. That Lifnei Tzimtzum Eidin Sof Mamala Kol HaMetzias, total Einay Movade. So now we know that. I mean, all the Gedalim hold, every Ben Teda holds that. But now we understand it in the context. And the Eibishter chose to conceal himself. Why? Because that Eir we could not access on our own. Like a Rav that has to conceal his Seichel Bli Gvul in order for the Talmud to be able to even exist, let alone to understand what the teacher is saying. Which tells you that even though the Talmud right now is only receiving a limited amount from the teacher, but why did the teacher have to be mitzamtzum himself if it's completely off limits? By Mafkamina. Because the Tzimtzum alone tells you that he wants to be Megalad, but you can't do it immediately, so it has to first be concealed. And Tzimtzum b'shvil ha'gilui, the whole purpose of the Helam is in order to bring Gilui. In effect, what that means is that ultimately we could access Lifnei HaTzimtzum, not b'tchilas habriya, like the Rebbe Rashab explains at the beginning of Samach Vov. That was the Chiddush. If the Eir after the Tzimtzum through Aved is going to return from Lifnei HaTzimtzum, so you're back to square one. What did you accomplish? The Eir was there, so he says two answers. One is the Chiddush is that now it can be by the Makablim, the Kalim can receive the Eir. That was not possible before the Tzimtzum. And then the bigger Chiddush is that the Takabir Eir Chodesh that wasn't even there Lifnei Tzimtzum in any Giladik way. Mamash HaChiddush. So that Arizal's Chiddush of Tzimtzum is actually counterintuitive. You think it's all about concealment. It's actually, the Chiddush is that it creates a kesher. Just al derech zeh and nigla. The Rebbe gives it's emphasized very many times that when you make Havdalah between Shabbos and Chayil, so everyone, but Pashtus it means Havdul ben Kedesh l'Chayil, ben Sheishis Yimei Amaisa and Yom HaShvi. But the Rebbe says no, the Havdalah actually allows for there now to be a kesher between Shabbos and Chayil. Because if you don't have Havdalah and everything's mixed together in Baravuvia, you don't have the right boundaries. In other words, boundaries are not meant to be magbil, boundaries are meant to be ma'achid. So boundary is not a stira to Agdus. It's reflecting realistically the reality that Kedesh is not Chayil. But once you know that, then you could be Mekadesh as Chayil. Chul Naltaras HaKedesh. So the Havdalah, like in this case, the Tzimtzum is not an end in itself. That itself allows you now. If you don't make the Havdalah, then you can never be Mamshach something of that level. Okay, with that in mind, that the Tzimtzum actually creates now a Kesher to even the Einareich of Elikus, whereas all the other Mukabalim would say there's a Kesher to high levels, Kesher, or even whatever level it is, but it's still Sof Kol Sof, Ilav Olol, and it's not complete to Elikus as Elikus is completely on his own. The Eibishter as he is Behechel Malchusei, Beloshna Arizal Lifnei Tzimtzum. So that's the Chidush. So now the question is, what exactly does this Tzimtzum, how does it manifest this Tzimtzum? You could argue, and we'll talk about the two different opinions in a moment. You could argue, okay, fine. Now we know the Eibishter Shalei Be'erech, And that's why there's a need for a tzimtzum. But b'peil mamish, what's our kesher to elikus lifnei tzimtzum? You could say b'derech shlila. The elikus, like mamala kalalmin or the kav. There we have a kesher direct. You do a mitzvah. So you mekadosh, like I said, chulin. You put on tefillin on your hand. It changes your hand. It makes it into a yad mechaleket tzedakah. You learn Torah. Your mind gets connected with the Eibishter's chokhmah. That's be'efen chiyuv. But if you want to connect to Lakuz, that's not Lefi Erech HaNevrayim. There, the only way is through Shlila. There's no Chiyuv, because it's Shlei Berech. That was that Arizal came to teach. So in other words, Kipshute would mean, not, and we'll talk a minute about the Alter Rebbe in a second, but Kipshute means, in a Chanami, that's what that Arizal came to Mechadish, literally. That now we know the Eibishter Shlei Berech. You want to reach Atzilus, or even Ak, any dargel acharat tzimtzum, that's through Aveda and Birur v'zichuch hametzias hanevroim, and you mezachich and you become a keli talakus. In simple asias, a human being on this earth is born a yesh, and through Aveda his mezachich is yesh, he's mavada through bittul, and the yesh becomes a yesh that's a keli talakus. And we learn in Chassidus at length what that means. That every part of you, like the ovis, hein hen amarkov, is the ultimate amarkov to what? Not to elikus bligvul, to the bligvul of Elikus, to Elikus in Atzilus. So your chesed in Asiyah becomes Akeli to chesed Atzilus. To Yitzire, Abriya, to the way, all the way to Atzilus. But not higher than that. In the Asis of the Alter Rebbe, what he brings in Hagah and Perik Beis and a few places in Tanya, he says, Leilam Atzilus. The Achdus of Elikus with Welt is in Atzilus. That's where the Achdus, because that's where there's a connection. But L'mayla Matzilus is we don't know. Chochmasa is Baruch L'mayla Matzilus is Chakim b'lei b'chach miyediyah. You're familiar with Hagah. I mean, I could elaborate a bit. Just the Rambam holds Hu Amadu Hu Yidei how you do it. The Maral asked the question. The Eibush is higher than Das. Chassidus is metavik that the Arizal. I'm sorry. Chassidus is metavik that the Rambam is talking in Atzilus, meaning where Elikus is mislabish in the Esses Spheres, Chochmah, Bina, etc., Das. And the Maral is talking about L'mayla Matzilus. And the Alter Rebbe is talking there because Huva Chochmase Echad in Atzilus. But L'mayla Matzilus, no, we don't connect. So what is the Chiddush of that Rizal? That the connection is B'derech Shalei Be'erech. In other words, it's not through Chiyuv, but through Shlila. I once heard from one of the Mashbiim, and maybe you could say pshat is like that. Some argue with it, but those that hold Tzimtzum Pshute and Nafkamina would be a similarity would be rather how we hold how Elikus is found in Klippas. So we say in Klippa the Elikus is found in the Eifon of Heder. You can't say the Eibush is mislabish in the Klippa or Ra. You could say he's found there, but not b'Eifon Chiyuvi. In the Alter Rebbe, the famous Geras HaKedah Simcha Chofei, where he's defending. They burned then the Tzavos HaRevosh because they claimed it was apikursus. Because they said, the Baal Shem Tov said that the Shechina is mislabeshes, but techa klippas. How could you say such a thing? That's what the Alter Rebbe famously answers, that the Baal Shem Tov spoke in Yiddish. And the translator, even though the Teichen of Tzavos HaRevosh is accurate, but he must have mistranslated because it doesn't mean mislabeshes, he meant shechenes, ne'efa makif. What's the difference? Like the Alter Rebbe says, in Kedusha is bottle. In Pedic, what Pedic? In Pedic, Hay says, right? Or Dalit? Vov, sorry, Vov. He says, Kedusha, Kol Inyan is bittul, so it's a Keli Telekus. Klippa is Yesha, so it can't be a Keli. Like the Gemara says about Gaiva. Anivuhu. Basically, if your cup is full, there's no room for anything else. So Klippa, you don't say that, God forbid, everything has a nitzutz alaki, but it's like sometimes it says in Chassidus and Sholosh Klippas HaTmeis, which says Ein behem tev klal the Alter Rebbe and Sof Perek Aleph. So the Tzemach Tzedek and the Rebbe Rashab add Ein behem tev klal mitzad atzmam. But there's definitely a nitzutz because nothing can exist without God's kayach. Now, then, like the Rebbe Rashab says in the Maimer, it's like cheticha nasa nevela. So you could have a cheticha that's kosher. But if it falls into a pot that's not kosher, the chaticha is still be'etzem kosher, but it becomes like a nevela. You can no longer find it. But it was not. But it didn't start out that way. So in other words, the nitzutz kedusha is nechshach. It says it's so dark that you can't see the spark. But that doesn't mean there isn't a spark. That's why a Baal Tshuva can. That's for us. It's also b'dei chitzenim, like the Alter Rebbe says later in Perek Zayin. But for a Baal Tshuva who does tshuva, especially ma'ava, he's able to extract that nitzutz. So al derech zeh, you could explain, according to those that hold Tzimtzum Kipshutei, Elokus is everywhere, but not be'efer chiyuvi. Elam haza hagashmi, as they would hold, is like what we hold is klippus. Kimuvin, there's a difference between ra and reshus, but nevertheless, according to this shita, you could say, yeah, fine, you can experience the shalei be'erech of Elokus, which is the chiddush of the Arizal, but not in a way that is direct me'efer chiyuvi. And hence, Tzimtzum Shalei Kipshutei, which means the Eibishter was beferish mailim that madrega. We know now there's a madrega that's higher than the Tzimtzum, but that's ba'efer shel siluk and removed from us. Now, let me explain this further. The Rebbe points out here that we're not talking now what it says in Perek Beis and Shari Yichud V'Amuna, where he says that that's Poshet Avei Zara, those that hold, and he says they're medame the Eibishter's creation to yesh miyesh, which is complete to hepech hatera. That's mitzad chesodin of the Eibishter. But Tzimtzum Kipshutei explains the Rebbe is coming mitzad gadlus. So what's the argument? Why are they arguing Tzimtzum Kipshutei dafke? Actually, because they want two things they want to demonstrate. Number one is that the Eibishter and Welt, which is so inferior to Elokus, can't be united in a chiyuvdik way. So it's actually to bring out the godless of the Beta. The Yeshua Levov brings a mashal for this, famous mashal. That's his mashal. That when the Eibishter looks at this world, and the klippus and sitra achar, it's like a melech that's looking through the window of a bathroom. That's what he says. He can't be there begashmius. So it's like looking through a window. Now, Kemuvan, the posha that he's not meaning mashal kipshutei, that it's physically like that, because Alter Rebbe says clearly the Eibishter is not memikri aguf, but in concept he can't be there be'efer chiyuvi. So it's kilu like he's mistakel on it be'efer makif. So the kus is there, but it's an efer makif. Mitzad el the Eibishter kemuven, there's no helam, but mitzad us we can never unite an inferior mortal and world that's filled with klippos v'sitra achar tel the kus. The only way we can bring Elokus into this world when it comes to that is b'derech shlila. But if in chiyuv we can bring Elokus that's lefi erech elements. But the shalei be'erech of Elokus, that which is beyond, no. So therefore, it's not a problem. For example, those that hold Tzimtzum Kipshutei, you could say, one second, the Gemara says b'feir shchinta begalusa. But the answer to that is shchinta begalusa, not atzmus begalusa, not erein sof before the Tzimtzum begalusa. Shechina, which is the darga of Malchus, Shechenes. So yes, everyone agrees there's a darga of Elokus. I mean, no one can disagree that they and they could even hold that his chachus b'savus is b'chol rega v'rega. But you know what? From a darga of an Elokus that relates to Welt. The darga that the Rizal is machadash, the shalei be'erech is only b'derech shlila. That would be the shita of Tzimtzum Kipshutei. I'm not getting yet into Moed and Oyer. That's another discussion, which we'll hopefully get to. I first want to talk about Kipshutei and not Kipshutei.
If they're asking that the Eibishter Shechenes goes, why do you need to come up to the mashal that the king is looking to the bathroom?
The pasha is because the bathroom is more of a dugma for klippus and sitra achra, not just elam haza. That's most likely. I have to look again, but I'm almost sure that's what he's saying. That's why it's a bath. That's why he compares it to a bathroom. Mokum shel zevel, I think he says zevel or the waste. In other words, how do you explain that Elokus mamish in dvorim nemuusim? Divrei reshus, you could say, okay, something is like a tree or an apple or a bird. I think that would be the main nekuda. Okay, now what about the Tzimtzum Shalei Kipshutei? We still say there's a Tzimtzum. I should add one more thing before I go there, which also explains another thing that a lot of people ask. Those that hold Tzimtzum Kipshutei cannot disagree that there's a kav that comes after the Tzimtzum, because that is all the Feder says. There's no machlekes in that at all. That after the Tzimtzum comes a kav kotzer v'dak, that's chozer v'hoyer, and it becomes a sherish ha'eres that go later with mislabish and kalim. Everyone agrees because the same Arizal that says Tzimtzum also says kav, which tells you that the Tzimtzum Kipshutei is not in the kav, because the Tzimtzum precedes the kav. Means that the kav that comes after the Tzimtzum beferish is mislabish And that's why I said before that you could have a chiyuv dika relation, but it's only with a kav, not with a lifnei tzimtzum. How they would explain chozer v'hoyer is a good question. I just thought of it right now when I said it, because chozer v'hoyer seems to indicate that it is being mamshech something from lifnei tzimtzum. You'd have to say probably that they would say chozer v'hoyer simply means the eir is rooted there, but doesn't mean we can access it. In Chassidus, Beferish doesn't say that because Chassidus go shalei kipshut. They say chozer v'hoyer has a whole different meaning, as I'll explain in a moment, that you're actually getting the eir from lifnei tzimtzum, except it's just channeled through the kav. Okay, so this is that shita. And we'll soon talk about why did the Rebbe say that it makes more sense. First, let's talk about the other shita, the shita that we do, that the Alter Rebbe does go by, based on what he heard from his Rabbeim. And that is, Tzimtzum is not kipshute, which means Tzimtzum, there is a Tzimtzum. No, it's not kipshute. I remember someone asking me a while back, he says, if it's not kipshute, so what, back to square one, what are that is on Machadish? That's time that Tzimtzum not kipshute. Tzimtzum kipshute, you could say, is a major chiddush. But the answer is no. The Tzimtzum is still a Tzimtzum arishin. And we call it b'derech siluk. But it doesn't mean siluk, it means helam. A helam, complete helam. So what's the nekuda here? That we actually can access Erein Sof Lifnei Tzimtzum be'efen chiyuvi. But with big qualification. You can't do that in step one. Because if you could do that in step one, why would you need a Tzimtzum? In other words, to put it in Asius, I mentioned before with the student and the Rav and the Rav and the Talmud, the reason it was a Tzimtzum is because the Talmud cannot receive the Eir HaBlikvul of the Rav. I mean, it can move in a human Rav is not Blikvul, but it's a moshel. But after there's a Tzimtzum, then comes a Kav that the Rav starts teaching the student step by step, Aleph Beis, Kametz Aleph A, and so on. Then you go B'chamash L'Mikra, B'Nesed L'Mishnah, B'chamesh Esed L'Gemara, Chulu V'chulu. So then it says, Ada Boyin Shnin Koi Inish Adaita Derav. So at 40 years old, whether it's 40 years from when he learned it or 40 years when you become Ben Arbaim Labina, he beferish Koi Inish Adaita Derav. I think that Samachvov brings that by Mechazal. That means he can get the Rav as he was, Lifnei Tzimtzum. Now, those that hold Kipshutei will say the Eibishter is not a Rav, and there's Dargis and the Eibishter's Giluim that there's no way you can access directly. But the Shita of Tzimtzum, not Kipshutei, is saying that you can actually access Erein Sof Lifnei Tzimtzum through the proper Aveda of Birur V'Zichuch Ha'elam and Birur V'Zichuch of the Nefesh Habamis, and slowly acclimate yourself. Just like a student expands, his mind expands, and the Kalim become more and more Mizuchach, more refined, that you can draw not only Eir HaMamala Kalam or Sevev L'Achret Tzimtzum, but you could even get to the Eir Lifnei Tzimtzum. In Zayin Beis, especially in Chelik Beis, he elaborates at length, literally hundreds of pages of how that's done. That you actually have to transform the Tzimtzum and be Megala that Kol Inyone is B'Shvil Hagili. So I'm not going to go through the whole process, how you do it, but Chassidus Chabad clearly, without ever saying the word Kipshute, not Kipshute, and I'm thinking maybe the reason is once the Alter Rebbe Paskin Sharich Ramin, it's not Kipshute, maybe the Rabbeim didn't even want to go and talk about the Kipshute. The Rebbe went, and he could explain also many reasons why, in Deir Ashvi, but that we'll talk about later. So there's Arichas Gedel in Chassidus that talks about how Yitaka can access Lifnei Tzimtzum, and that's why we can talk about it. And more than that, we even talk about levels Lifnei Tzimtzum. We don't just say the Eibishter Tzimtzum Atzmei, and now we know the Shalei Berach. There's a whole Arichas Gedela right in the beginning of Ayin Beis. He begins everything Lifnei Tzimtzum, Estes Sfiras Agnuzis, and all the Dargis and all the Maimonim, especially later Maimonim. The earlier Maimonim of Chassidus Chabad doesn't talk about it so much. Okay. So, as I said, I'm not going to go through the details of how you do it, but it's very clear that the Shita of Tzimtzum Shalei Kipshute is dramatically different than Kipshute, that you can have a Chiyuv Dika connection all the way to the Dachsta Dagas of Elikus, which is how, by us, it's a Dover Poshet. You know, if everybody says it's, even children, the Losad Love, they'll have Gilei Elikus, Mamish Lamata, Dira B'Tachteinim, V'Nigla Kved Hashem, in this world. We don't say it will be derech shlila. We say that the Elikus, Atzmus, will be in his gala in this world. Now, obviously, Atzmus always remains Atzmus. Chassidus to say that the Welt becomes the Eibishter. But the Yesh HaNivra will be one with the Yesh HaMiti. So all the things you grew up with and you learn in Sichos, is all the maskana. But it didn't begin that way. There were shittas that don't hold that way. In other words, this would be the main nafkamina between kipshute and shlei kipshute. I'll give a few examples. One nafkamina would be, what's the tafkid adam alei adamas on this earth? So if you ask most not Chassidish Rabbanim or Rosh Yeshivas, they'll say to do Torah mitzvahs in this world to prepare for Elam Haba. And we even laugh at that. If you go based on Chassidus Chabad, especially Tanya Perek Lamed Vav, Lasos Leis Bora Dira B'Tachtein. B'Dakus, this is like the machlekes between the Rambam and the Ramban. What's Tachlis Aschar? Is it Neshamas without Gufim? Which makes a lot of sense because the Rambam says clearly, yes, we'll go through Tchias HaMeis and Matkufa, but ultimately, a guf can never experience a lakus like a neshama can. Nenim Ziv Ashchina. A guf can understand a lakus l'fi erech haguf. But a lakus that's higher than that, you need a neshama. The Ramban says no, and says clearly the Alter Rebbe Chassidus paskins like the Ramban. There you have an afkamina. I'm not going to say that the Rambam and this approach is that the Rambam didn't talk about Tzimtzum, so he can't speak in those asias. But a bedakus, you can say that's an afkamina. If you can have a chiyuv, if Elam Hazar can have a chiyuv connection with the highest levels of Elikus, then the shamas begufim would be the ultimate schar. If it can't, you'd have to say the guf can't really accept that high dargas of air, so it has to be the neshama alone. That's one nafkamina. Now, this I have not seen befedish anywhere that it says that's nafkamina. I'm just trying to explain what would be my nafkamina, kipshute, not kipshute. And the tafkid would be the difference. So when the Rebbe, everyone thinks it's the chiddush of the Rebbe. The Alter Rebbe says, "Nesava Kosh Baruch Hu Lislei Dira B'Tachtenim." It's not a small statement. And he said, "Befedish not an Elam Esal Yenim, Hayel Lehem Yirid Me'er Panav Yisbarach." The highest levels. That's basically saying that you can access Elikus, the highest levels of Elikus in Tachtenim, even more than Natzilus. Now he doesn't use the words Lifnei Tzimtzum there, but the implication is very clear. That direlei betachtenim, Chassidus says later, direlei latzmusei is barach betachtenim. And it's a dira. Dira is not shlila, it's chiv. When you live in your home, you're not just, you're in there bislapshus. So dira betachtenim essentially implies that the highest levels of elikus will be bislabish in this world. But again, only after a long aveda and yigiyah, thousands of years of golus, and all the Aveda Mesiris Nefesh that was Mizachich this world. It's not automatic. That was the toss of Kerach, where he said, you know what, Tachtenim, fine. We don't need Maduat Tisnasu. We don't need anybody. Call it Eidig Deshimhem. Yeah, but Etzem, that's that way. But you still need Aveda to bring the Giluyim into this world. So it would be a Kelit Elikus, lower levels of Elikus, ultimately even to the levels Lifnei Tzimtzum. So in a way, you could even say the very concept of Shlichus, which seems to go against, you could argue, two major things. After Churban Bayesheni, we know when Rabbi Yechon ben Zakkai said, "Tenli Yavne v'Chachameha," that Eden, like it says in Yecheskel, Sefer Yecheskel, he asked the Eibishter, "What will be now? Now there's no Beis Hamikdash. How will Eden how will they survive?" So he says the famous pasuk, "Ve'eyela Migdash Ma'at." They should build Bati Knesiyas and Bati Midrashas. And that will be like a mini Beis HaMikdash, Mikdash Ma'at. So it was known that right after the Golus, what was the first thing Jews did? They couldn't go back to Eretz Yisrael. Nicht mit uns wollen, wir gegangen in Golus, and not with our will can we go back. But wherever we go in Golus, we're going to build strong bastions, strongholds of Yiddishkeit. What did Eden do? Every community built shuls, and mikvoyes and shuls but the midrashim, they built as much as they could, and for many years that's how Jews survived. So after World War II, and for the first time there was freedom, so this was a taina that all the Eden said we have to now build strong communities in Williamsburg, in Bnei Brak, in Yerushalayim, Crown Heights, in Borough Park. Comes the Rebbe and says no, he's sending everybody out. And from the Rebbe's point of view, he said once he doesn't mind if he only has a minion in Crown Heights. He's sending everybody out Ashlichus, which l'cheira goes against so-called the logic, how many Yidden are there already? And how many Frumi Yidden are there? You'd think and there's also halacha about it. If you have to choose a city where to live, what does Shulchan Aruch say? choose a city with a Shemri Torah mitzvahs. You shouldn't have nisyanis. And the Rebbe went and Keilu went against that. Now, Chamuv and Poshet, that's not against the Chaz v'Shalom. So a few things. First of all, Pekuach Nefesh changes everything. Pekuach Nefesh of so many Eden out there. Second of all, the Shitta of Chabad was never that the world is a stira telekus. The Shitta of the Kipshute, whether it's the Gra or others, was that, yes, we are in this world only because the Eibishter put us here. But as much as possible, avoid the world as much as possible. Not complete precious, but al derech zeh. And by us, we know precious is not a derech. But no one ever said that there were prushim. There were prushim, and there was a kufis in by Eden that people fasted and sigufim. Chassidus, and especially Chassidus Chabad, is shale of that. Tainesim and sigufim, you could say in Aveda, is al derech tzimtzum kipshute. Because it means your guf cannot be a keli talakus. The only way is to break it, meaning shlila. Your way to get lakus is through shlila. Again, I'm not going to say it's I can move, and I'm just using it as an example. Mashenk in the derech of chiyuv, of birur, not shlila. Chiyuv, birur is beferish based on tzimtzum shalei kipshute, because the velt is taka behelim, elakus is behelim. I'm not saying it's begoli, but it's reachable. You can reach elakus, even the highest levels of elakus. Now I have to obviously qualify. This does not mean that Chassidus doesn't talk about iskafia. It doesn't mean that we don't fast on Yom Kippur, or that we don't have other areas where it has to be Sur Merah. So it's not a machlekes in the sense where one says everything is chiyuv, the other one says everything is shlila. Just like those that hold tzimtzum kipshut, they don't hold everything is shlila. Though the shit of tzimtzum shalei kipshut doesn't mean everything is b'chiyuv. Kemovin, there's lefi kol achad v'chad lefum shura delay. We all need iskafia and isapcha. And sometimes the way to get to Iskafia is through Iskafia. So it's not like that there's always chiyuv. I mean, there's befeiris things, there's leisa sen, there's mitzvah sesa. No one disagrees with that. The question is, where is it ultimately going? Is it a shlila b'tachlis? In other words, ultimately, according to Lekib Pshute, it would be that even the leisa sen, even the Iskafia, and even the bittul is ultimately going to lead to yichud. Where Tzimtzum Kipshute will not lead to yichud with the highest dargahs of elikus, or better put, the yichud will be b'derech shlila, not b'derech chiyuv. So that's a general difference. Now, a lot more can be said on this. And unless someone has a question on this, I'll go over now to Moyer and Oyer, because that is going to be another dimension to all of this. Any questions? So based on this, before I go to Moyer and Oyer, let's go back to the letter in Tafshin Gimel. So the word there is that what he said, the Rebbe says that dafke le'shittas hadach, that the tzimtzum is not kipshute and only in oir. And the letter here he says actually in the lowest levels of oir. Yeah. So what would the others hold? Would they hold that connection to Matan Torah or to Rashbi and the Idra? We also have a connection, Kemuv and Poshet. Chaz v'shalom to say otherwise. But ultimately it's not mamish a'ardus, like the Rebbe says in the Rebbe's Asius. These are the Rebbe's words, that mamish, let's see, itay, b'zeh ha'mokim, b'zuh ha'rega, itay imay mamish. All those levels are mamish with us. So they would say it's more, in the previous datas, maybe the fact that we are children of those g'delim, so we obviously carry their genes. But to say Eisei Mamish, that it causes Shum Tfisas Mokum Mitzias Klal, Lav Dafke. They also explain something else. You know, we made the famous jokes that are about Litvaks and so on, that if they learn a Gemara and they don't understand it, they stay. Was that a Macha? That's what I just said? Well, that was a Tkiya. Yeah. So, we make these jokes that when they don't understand a Gemara, it's easier for them to say that they have to make a tikkun tos. They change the hagah. Now, this is one of the jokes that go around. I'm not going to say that as a fact because there are many Rosh Yeshivas that I personally know and over the generations, and by them every word in Torah is Kaddish, Torah Shabbat Peh as well. But nevertheless, the question is, you can make the argument that the Gemara can move in the Poshet. No one can argue with the Gemara after Chsimas Hashas. It's considered just like Torah Shebiksav from a point of view of authority. But it's still not Torah Shebiksav. And it's still human beings that wrote and taught the Gemara. So when you look, for example, that Rabbi Levi Yitzchak writes in his famous letter, that even Shibdusa, even a Gemara that says something is completely nonsense, is also mamash nitin l'Moshe Sinai. That type of emphasis, that every letter in Torah Shabbat Peh is also mamash elikus. You're not going to find that in any svarim that are not Chassidish svarim like the Rebbe's approach. And not Chas v'sholom because they think it's less kedusha satera, or they learn with less passion, because that idea that it creates what he calls is only possible when you understand that elikus is here, even the highest levels of elikus lifnei Tzimtzum, but it's concealed, and we have to reveal it. To say that there are dargos and elikus that you can only access through shlila, sof kol sof means that things in this world are not mamish b'diuk ba'achdus b'efen chiyuvi with elikus, only b'derech shlila. So it could also explain perhaps that type of almost, I would say even, I don't say fanaticism, but that type of absolute unwavering approach to everything in this world being that type of kedusha. Like the concept to say that kedusha le'zozim im kemo, famous story that the Rebbe Rashab was standing, Friedrich Rebbe writes in the first Maimer that he delivered, Reishis Goyim Amolek Tafresh Pei. The Rebbe brings it in Vayikra Mem Zayin, Tavshim Mem Zayin, that his father was standing by the table with a gartla and kapota and speaking to the Rebbe Marash as if he was there, even though it was after the Stalkus. And the Rebbe Friedrich Rebbe says, because the Avedas HaTzadik and even his kelim and his table and his chair and all his tachshitim, everything is duraginum with alakus, mamish, as it was exactly when he was alive. That is definitely a concept that you're going to see in Chassidus. Not going to see it elsewhere. And some will even say that it sounds radical. That's the word I wanted, radical. In other words, that idea of Eined Mulvade, Kipshute. I mean, I once saw, I don't want to say a name, but a person in the Alamdan, but not in the Chassidish world. Someone asked him Pshat in one of the Sichos of the Rebbe, and he says, mainstream Judaism does not accept the radical interpretation of God's presence in this world, of Chassidim. So I met this fellow, and I said, the radical, what does that mean? That God actually exists here? Eined Mulvade means, he says, yeah, by us, Elokus is there, but it's not quite as you see it, like mamish present this second. Because that sounds very radical, because it sounds like, so in other words, bedakas dedakus, and I'm saying bedakas dedakus, I'm not going to say a pirud, but once you say it's shlila, not chiyuv, tzimtzum kipshute, in other words, there's something that Elokus is not nish durach and durach welt. The only way it will is when we're mevatel the welt, which of course explains in a deeper way what shlichus is all about, and how we engage with the world. Again, this doesn't mean that you can do everything you like. Kemuvan has to be mizgeres hateira v'halocha, and with all the hidurim and all the dinim. It's not like, okay, everything goes. The Welt is still, there's a teira that tells you what you could do, what you can't do. But you can understand the achdus on that deeper level. Now, I see it's already late. We have a few more minutes. So I don't want to go, the Moyer and Oyer, I'll just say, next week I'll do it more in detail. It requires much more. The Moyer and Oyer, just think of it in terms of Moyer being Etzem, and Oyer is Gili. So all this discussion that we're having now, if you go now the next step, you can say like this. You can say Tzimtzum Kipshute is L'gabe Oyer. Giluyim can be Be'efen Chiyuvi. But maybe the Etzem can be accessed. Or the other way around. Giluyim could be Be'efen Chiyuvi, but the Etzem has to be Be'efen Shlili. Which would mean Tzimtzum Kipshute in Moyer, or the other way around. Can you say that even that the etzem is here, but the giluyim are not here? In other words, when the Baal Shem Tov says that everyone has an etzem on a neshama, and even when a child is crying out kukuriku, and a ish poshet has as a kesher atzmi, does that mean that he's also capable of having a chiyuv dika relationship with the giluyim of Elokus? Or it means it's atzmi, which is in a way also b'derech shlil, not b'derech chiyuv. So this is what we'll talk about more in detail next week. The difference between Etzem and Gili, which one is accessible, which is not. And there the Rebbe says they're also four shittis actually. In other words, is it Tzimtzum Kipshute also in Moyer, only in Oyer, but not in Moyer, or also in Moyer, or Tzimtzum Kipshute, but also in Moyer, or only in Oyer, which again is going to be, the Dargah of Chassidus explains, it's going to be the most accessible is Shittis Chassidus. The least accessible is when you say Kipshute in Moyer and in Oyer. That means everything is off limits. Whereas those that hold Kipshute in Oyer but not in Moyer, so there you have you can have some access, but we'll discuss that more in detail. But that's the Nakud of Etzem and Giluyim. So, okay, we'll stop here. And anybody want to ask anything? You could always ask next week if you want to think it through.
How does bind Chassidus of a Pashut or Tzir?
It may not. It's a good question. It may not connect because Pashut and Mitzuri, you could argue, is after the Tzimtzum too. You could have two shittas in the Eir Elokhi that is the Fierach Ha'elamis. You could say the Eir is more Pashut or the Eir is Mitzuyir. But B'dakus, it has a similarity in the sense when it's Pashut, it means our only connection to it is by losing our Tziyur. When it's Mitzuyir, it means the connection is Be'efin Chiyuvi. So there is a Dakas connection. But I've never seen that anywhere that they relate that those that hold Kipshute would hold more the Eris Apshutim. And those that hold not Kipshute, the Eris Mitzuyim. That I've never seen. But in Havonas and Yonim, you could see some Dakas Dikas Alams. Let me give it some more thought, and I'll get back maybe next week when I talk about it. Okay, everyone have a great day. Guten Chodesh. Okay.